I am Ruby, 30 years old, and for as long as I can remember, the word daughter has carried the weight of disappointment in my mother's eyes. She used to look at me as though I were an unfinished task, a mistake carved into her fate, and the cruelest part was that she never hid it. Daughters are just a burden. She sneered one night when I was 12, her voice sharp enough to cut through the darkness of our small, suffocating living room. I had been standing by the door clutching my school report card, desperate for a flicker of pride, but instead, her words crashed over me like stones. My father said nothing, as always, sipping his tea as though silence would shield him from guilt. That silence grew like poison inside me, and by the time I turned 18, I had already learned how to swallow insults whole, burying them deep where no one could see the scars. But those scars never healed. They became my secret fuel, my fire, the reason I studied harder than anyone else, worked longer hours than the men who mocked me, and learned how to wear a smile like armor. Every night I whispered to myself, I will rise. I will own my life. And though my mother's sneers tried to convince me otherwise, I carved a promise into my soul. One day, she would see my name not as a burden, but as power. That day, I told myself, would come in a place she least expected, in a court, where her voice would tremble, and the world would finally hear mine. The years that followed were not kind, but they were mine, and I wore each struggle like a hidden metal pin to my chest. While my mother paraded my brother as the pride of the family, I was handed silence, mockery, and endless chores meant to remind me of my supposed place. Girls don't build empires, Ruby. She would scoff when I stayed up late with books spread across the kitchen table. Yet every sneer only pressed me further into my studies, until my mind became sharper than the knives she slammed against the cutting board. By the time I reached university, I was juggling 2 part-time jobs, an exhausting commute, and a scholarship that everyone insisted I would eventually lose. Everyone except me. I told myself, they can't steal what I've bled for. When graduation came, I walked the stage alone, no family in sight, but the sound of my name echoing in the auditorium felt louder than any applause. It was the first time I realized I didn't need their approval. I needed victory. My first job at a small law firm was like stepping into a battlefield where men laughed at my ambition, but I learned quickly. Ambition was my weapon, silence my shield. With every case, every late night buried in paperwork, I grew stronger, sharper, more dangerous. And through it all, one truth pulsed in my veins. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for the moment my mother would be forced to look me in the eye, not as a daughter she despised, but as a force she could never silence. It was during my 7th year as a lawyer that the first crack appeared in my mother's carefully guarded world, and I recognized it instantly, like a predator catching the scent of blood. A dispute over family property had begun, land my grandfather left behind, the kind of inheritance that could change futures. My mother and brother believed it already belonged to them, as though my existence had been erased from the bloodline itself. I overheard them one night on the phone, laughing about how I wouldn't dare challenge them, how I was still the same girl who once hid tears behind bedroom doors. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing my entire life for this very battle. I gathered documents, traced every legal loophole, and uncovered truths they thought were long buried. Piece by piece, I built a case not just of ownership, but of betrayal, neglect, and corruption that ran deep in my family's veins. Every late night felt like destiny unfolding, every paper signed like a weapon sharpened. And as I looked at my reflection in the mirror one dawn, eyes red from exhaustion, lips curved into a dangerous smile, I whispered, "This is it, Ruby. This is where the burden becomes the master." The court date was set. My mother would walk in expecting the same timid daughter she had crushed for 30 years, but what awaited her was not weakness. It was the storm she had unknowingly created, and now it was coming for her with all the fury of years silenced, all the rage of a girl turned into fire. The morning of the hearing, the air felt heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. I dressed not in fear but in deliberate defiance, a tailored black suit, sharp lines that matched the steel in my gaze. As I walked toward the courthouse, The city noises seemed distant, muffled beneath the pounding of my heartbeat. When I entered the courtroom, my mother sat there in her silk shawl, chin tilted with the arrogance of someone convinced the world bowed at her command. My brother leaned back smugly beside her, tapping his fingers against the table as though victory was already his. For a moment, a flicker of the old ache pierced my chest, the girl who once longed for their love. But it dissolved the instant my mother's eyes met mine, cold and dismissive, as if I were still that burden she had spat upon years ago. I inhaled deeply, straightened my shoulders, and reminded myself, I am not here for their approval. I am here for justice. When my name was called, it echoed through the chamber, commanding attention, slicing through the murmur of the crowd. I rose, walked to the center, and placed the evidence I had gathered on the judge's desk. Each page was a dagger, each document a reminder that I had not only survived their disdain, I had turned it into power. My mother's face twitched, ever so slightly, but enough for me to know. The storm had already begun, and she was standing directly in its path. As the proceedings unfolded, every word spoken felt like a blade drawn across years of buried wounds. The opposing lawyer, hired by my mother, tried to dismiss me as an emotional daughter driven by vengeance rather than reason, his voice dripping with mockery that echoed the very disdain I had endured since childhood. But I did not flinch. I rose with calculated calm, my arguments lined with precision, every citation of law delivered like a hammer striking iron. The courtroom leaned in as I dismantled their narrative piece by piece, exposing contradictions they thought hidden, revealing transactions they had buried under layers of deceit. My brother's smirk faltered when I presented bank records with his signature sprawled across them, proof of manipulation so damning that even the judge arched an eyebrow. My mother's hands, once steady and commanding, gripped the edge of the table with the faintest tremor. Yet, instead of satisfaction, I felt a strange hollowness gnaw at me, for deep inside, I had hoped she might finally see me, not as an enemy, not as a tool, but as a daughter worthy of her respect. That moment never came. Her eyes remained hard, sharp, filled with venom, as if my very act of standing tall was a betrayal she could never forgive. And it was in that realization that the fire within me blazed higher. I wasn't here to heal her love. I was here to strip away her illusions of power and claim what was rightfully mine, no matter how much she despised the truth of who I had become. Day after day, the case twisted into a battlefield of hidden agendas and unspoken family secrets, each revelation peeling back layers of rot that had festered for years. Witnesses came forward, an old family friend who remembered my grandfather's words, a former employee who had seen my brother forge documents under my mother's instruction. Every testimony was another crack in the empire of lies they had built. Yet, even as the evidence mounted, my mother never wavered in her contempt. She whispered insults under her breath, daggers disguised as words, ungrateful, shameless, traitor. I swallowed each one, not with pain this time, but with a strange, simmering strength. For every insult hurled, I built another wall inside myself, a fortress of resolve. At night, when exhaustion pulled at my bones, I would sit alone by my desk, staring at the scattered files, and whisper to my reflection, "You are no one's burden anymore, Ruby." It became my mantra, my shield against the storm. And though the courtroom battles drained me, though the sleepless nights left shadows beneath my eyes, I could feel the tide shifting. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the silent girl standing in the corner. I was the storm itself, tearing down the walls of deception brick by brick, and my mother, whether she admitted it or not, could feel the earth trembling beneath her throne. The turning point came on a gray morning when the judge allowed me to cross-examine my mother directly. As she took the stand, her posture radiated superiority, as though even the law itself bowed to her will. I approached slowly, every step measured, the silence of the courtroom thick with anticipation. "Did you, or did you not instruct your son to conceal assets belonging to this estate?" I asked, my voice steady, but edged with steel. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. You think you can trap me with your little questions? You're still that foolish girl who never knew her place. Gasps rippled through the room, but I did not falter. I leaned forward, sliding a document across the stand. Her own handwritten note, signed and dated, a damning instruction to my brother. The color drained from her face, her smile faltering into a twitch. For years I had dreamed of this moment. Imagine the satisfaction of watching her unravel, but in that instant I realized something far deeper. I wasn't simply exposing her lies. I was forcing her to face the reflection she had spent a lifetime avoiding. You called me a burden, I whispered, my voice carrying through the silent chamber. But today, it is you who weighs this family down. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the judge banging the gavel for order. My mother's eyes locked on mine, and for the first time, I saw not disdain, but fear. It was the smallest crack, but it was enough. The fortress of her control was beginning to crumble, and I was the one holding the hammer. The trial stretched into weeks, each day a relentless test of endurance, as though fate itself wanted to see how much I could withstand before breaking. Journalists began to appear in the gallery, their pens scratching feverishly as the whispers of a daughter challenging her own mother spread beyond the courtroom walls. Headlines called me defiant, rebellious, ruthless, and though the words were meant to sting, I wore them like badges of honor. At night, when I caught my reflection in the mirror of my small apartment, I no longer saw the trembling girl clutching a report card. I saw a woman whose eyes glowed with fire, whose back refused to bend, whose scars had become her greatest armor. Yet even as my resolve hardened, loneliness coiled itself around me. Friends kept their distance, fearful of being entangled in the spectacle. My brother, once smug, now spat venom whenever our paths crossed, his rage a fragile mask for his growing desperation. And my mother, oh, my mother, she stared at me with such venom that it might have broken me once. But now, her hatred only confirmed what I already knew. I had shifted the balance of power, and she could not bear it. Still, in the quiet hours, doubt sometimes whispered, what if victory meant becoming exactly like her, cold, unyielding, incapable of love? I would silence those thoughts by clutching the very documents that had sparked this war, reminding myself, this was not about vengeance alone. This was about survival, about claiming the life I had been denied, about proving that a daughter could rise from ashes and set fire to the lies that tried to bury her. The climax arrived on a day so bright it felt almost mocking, sunlight spilling across the marble floors of the courthouse as though justice itself had come to watch. The gallery was full, reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder, their cameras hungry for a headline, their whispers swirling like smoke. I stood tall at my table, documents stacked neatly before me, my hands steady despite the storm raging in my chest. The judge called for closing arguments, and I rose slowly, my heels clicking like a war drum against the silence. My mother's lawyer spoke first, his words slick with practiced charm, painting me as bitter, vindictive, ungrateful. Each syllable was a dagger meant to wound, but I let them glance off me, knowing the moment of reckoning was mine. When my turn came, I stepped forward, voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air. I spoke not just of evidence, but of years of being silenced, diminished, erased. I spoke of the will my grandfather left, the intent twisted by those who saw me as nothing more than a shadow. And then, with the eyes of the court fixed upon me, I laid down the final document, a notarized letter from my grandfather himself, his words declaring me rightful heir. The gasp that rippled through the chamber was deafening. My brother paled, his mask of arrogance collapsing. My mother stiffened, her face carved in stone, but her eyes betrayed the truth. For the first time, she realized the burden she had cast aside was the very force that would undo her reign. The judge's gavel struck, echoing like thunder, and in that suspended silence, the weight of decades shifted. His verdict was deliberate, measured, but each word landed with the force of destiny itself. The estate was mine. Ownership transferred. My name, Ruby, etched into records where once it had been erased. Applause did not erupt, This was not the kind of victory people celebrated aloud, but the hush that followed was louder than any cheer, the hush of recognition, of inevitability. My brother slumped in his chair, face buried in trembling hands, while my mother remained upright, rigid, her mask cracking only at the edges where fury met disbelief. I turned toward her, and though I expected satisfaction, what I felt was something far more haunting. I saw not a tyrant, but a woman undone by her own cruelty, trapped in the very cage she had built for me. The burden she had hurled upon me all my life had rolled back onto her shoulders, crushing the illusion of her invincibility. As I walked out of the courtroom, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions I barely heard, the sunlight felt different. No longer mocking, but cleansing, like a fire burning away the rot. Yet inside, I knew this was not just the end of a trial. This was the severing of chains, the moment a daughter became more than the scorn she endured. The world had shifted, and so had I. For the first time in 30 years, the word daughter no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a crown. In the days that followed, the world seemed both louder and quieter at once. News outlets splashed my face across their headlines, calling me the daughter who defied, while strangers stopped me on the street to whisper words of admiration I had never expected to hear. Yet the applause of the world could not fill the silence in my heart, the silence left behind by the family I had destroyed and, in turn, been destroyed by. My brother refused to look at me, his rage simmering into exile, while my mother locked herself away, her empire of scorn reduced to walls that echoed only with her bitterness. Sometimes I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling of the house that was now mine, wondering if victory was meant to feel this hollow. I had achieved what I swore I would, the sneering voice of my mother silenced by the weight of my name carved into ownership. But alongside triumph lurked grief. Grief for the childhood that had never known tenderness. Grief for the mother I had longed for but never received. And still, beneath it all, a quiet flame of pride burned steady. I had survived the crucible they had thrown me into, emerged not broken but reforged, steel where once there had been only fragile glass. And as I walked through the halls of my new life, I began to understand that my story was no longer just about revenge. It was about resilience, about transformation, about proving that no burden, no sneer, no cruelty could smother the fire of a daughter who refused to be erased. And now, as I stand at the edge of everything I fought for, I finally see the truth of my journey. It was never just about the land, the will, or even the courtroom victory. It was about reclaiming myself, about taking back the fragments of dignity stripped from me one sneer at a time. My mother still will not speak to me, her pride too brittle, her heart too hardened, but I no longer crave her approval. I have built my own voice, my own name, my own empire carved from the ashes of her rejection. At 30 years old, I no longer hide tears in the dark. I wield them as proof that I bled, that I endured, that I rose. This story is not only mine, but for every girl ever called a burden, every daughter silenced by tradition, every woman told she was too weak to rise. To them I say, let your scars become your strength, let your silence sharpen into fire, let your story rewrite the lies written against you. My name is Ruby. I was called a burden, erased, belittled, but now my name is carved into history, unshakable. This is not the end of my fight. It is the beginning of my reign. And if you felt my journey, if you carried even a spark of my fire as you listened, then do not walk away quietly. Stand with me. Share my story. Let others hear the storm I became. Like, subscribe, and witness how a daughter once silenced turned her mother's curse into her crown.